I was a victim of a crime. Someone broke into my home and I called the police for help.
My friend had been murdered, and it could just have easily been me.
The series not shying away from those seemingly awkward, puzzling behaviors.
I don't look back on those years and those moments and cringe.
Ciao. There was Carabinieri. It's like, this is like your state police and they're going to send someone now.
Amanda, you hear me?
Something happens, you call the police, which is why when I came home and discovered that my house had been broken into, I called the police.
Oh, excuse me. That's not entirely accurate.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and happy Halloween, and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is what Amanda Knox wrote in her own book, Waiting to be Heard, about the incident, about calling the police. She wrote, he, meaning Sollecito, rammed the door with his shoulder, hard, nothing. He kicked next to the handle, it didn't budge. I called my mom again. Mom, I said, someone broke into our house and we can't find Meredith. What should we do? Amanda, call the police, she said. Now, you've just heard a couple of clips where you see and you hear Knox herself saying she saw that she got broken into and she called the police. But in her own book, you can see the narrative is different, is that she sees that they've been broken into and she then calls her mother. That wasn't the first thing she did. The first thing she did wasn't calling the police. The first thing she did was calling her mother. And according to call records, which we'll get to in a moment, she called her mother on 3 separate occasions. Then she writes, when we went back upstairs to the waiting room, my family called me one after another. This is at the police station. She says, I have a tendency to talk too loudly when I'm excited. That night, explaining to them what had happened wasn't an exception, but I didn't notice this. I had to repeat my story for each caller, how I'd been the first one home and hadn't realized there had been a break-in, how Raffaele and I had called the police. So here it is, Raffaele and I called the police. And then there's this third instance. She writes, in testifying, I wanted to make a point. You guys make me sound like I was crazy, that I found 3 droplets of blood in the bathroom sink and didn't call the police immediately. So when she says that, she's kind of acknowledging that she didn't call the police immediately. And we know from her own version of events that she left Sollecito that morning, went home, showered, was in the house where apparently this break-in occurred, found the door open, found blood, and didn't call the police immediately. When you read Knox's book and when you get to know her quite well, you find out how clever she is at telling stories.
In 2007, 2 young girls went to go study abroad in Perugia, Italy, and one of us survived the experience. So I'm incredibly grateful and lucky to have been the one who got to go home and survive, the one who lived.
There she's almost expropriating the Harry Potter aphorism, the boy who lived. And of course, Amanda Knox was a huge Harry Potter fan. That's part of why she was so infatuated with Sollecito, because to her he looked like Harry Potter, complete with the glasses. He even had a scarf that I think were in the colors of Gryffindor, the maroon and yellow. And she was actually reading that book, the last book in the series, I think in German. I think she'd already read it in Italian at the time of the incident. Remember also that time of the incident was just following Halloween, and of course Meredith didn't invite her to their Halloween revelries. Remember, it was Meredith and something like 7 or 8 of her friends, so there was a big expat contingent, and of course Knox wasn't invited to that. Knox did get dressed up. For Knox, Halloween was a big deal coming from America. She even got Sollecito to dress up as well, but they had nowhere to go to and no one to party with, because Meredith and Meredith's friends hadn't invited them to their sort of Halloween celebration. Now, if you read Knox's book without thinking critically, you'd assume that she said she did call the police, and if you do think critically and try to check, she's not explicit that she didn't either. So what really happened here? Well, we're going to deal with that in this analysis. Before we get to that, I want to show you this beautiful picture of Meredith Kercher. It is really interesting that you don't see a single picture of Knox and Kercher together. I mean, they were together, I think, in that house for 2 months. There's not a single picture of them together. In the Hulu series, you see them sort of running around Perugia, and that creates kind of a false impression because they certainly didn't even pose for a single picture together. And the other thing that I think is interesting is in all the coverage of this case, you never really get a sense that Knox has a photo of Kercher and wants to tell her story and wants the focus to be on her, the person that actually got murdered. Instead, she wants the focus to be on herself, that she's the victim here. It could just as well as been her. And she also sometimes describes herself as if they were the two sides of a different coin, that if Meredith was the side of one coin, she was the other. And so I do think if you don't pay that much attention to what Knox is saying, it really does pass the test. It does sort of come across as acceptable. But what happens when you look a lot closer, when you spend a lot more time on it? And I've written 6 books on this case, so I really have gone into the subtleties. In any event, before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button, and let's continue. So as true crime mysteries go, this isn't a very difficult question to ask or indeed answer. I think the biggest difficulty we have in this area is with people who don't want to think about it, because it starts to make them uncomfortable, and it should. In this analysis, I'm going to take you on a brief recon through one of the most basic areas of the Knox case, and I can guarantee you most people don't know the answer, one way or another, to this most basic question, including Jake Tapper, the CNN reporter who interviewed Knox. So let's start with generic information. What does Google say when you search, did Amanda Knox call the police? Well, the answer isn't simply yes. The first thing you see is inconsistencies. Then something about the delay between Knox's return home and her call to the police. And then there's also her changing her story to the police. Now, interestingly, whenever people interview Knox, none of the interviews seem to know this aspect of it and even think to question Knox on it. Knox seems to get a free ride through these interviews where no one asks her any really critical questions. So on this simple question, Google didn't simply answer yes, but reports on inconsistencies and delays, as well as her apparently lying to the police. But let's compare apples with apples. What happens when we search whether Dylan Mortensen, the survivor in the Idaho 4 tragedy, when she called police? And here's the answer, quite simply. Yes, they did call 911 midday on November 13th. We get a much shorter, simpler answer, but the even shorter answer is yes. Now, what happens if we frame the question negatively? Amanda Knox didn't call the police. And so here it is. Amanda Knox did not immediately call the police after discovering blood and a broken window in her apartment following the murder of Meredith Kercher. So I think if you're going to have this conversation about how Knox found herself being a suspect in this case, I think one needs to acknowledge the fact that she didn't immediately call the police and talk about that. But does she ever do that? Here's another article. Why the Amanda Knox case still doesn't make any sense. This is from 9 years ago. Why didn't Knox call the police when she saw blood in their bathroom? Again, we get a situation that is regarded as strange or unusual. One thing Dylan Mortensen didn't do was go to someone else's home before she called police. Meanwhile, what does Knox's boyfriend say in his book on the question of this call? He says, G'day, that's Rudy G'day, the third person, did not call the police as Amanda and I did. And so he basically frames it as Amanda and I called the police. Both of us called the police. And in her recent interview with Gwyneth Paltrow, she says something similar. It's basically that we called the police, and so that means I called the police.
I go into Philomena's room, and it's ransacked. The window is broken. Clearly there's been a break-in. And immediately I tell my boyfriend, can you please call the cops? Because I don't even know how to call the cops in Italy.
Do you see what I mean by saying she's a clever storyteller? Because here she's saying, I immediately tell my friend to call the police. So how can you accuse her of not immediately calling the police? And of course, the interviewer doesn't really know enough about this case to know what to ask. Can you see that? So how about an independent narrator like John Follain? What does he say? Call the police, Edda told her. Chris butted in. Amanda, get the hell out of that house. Something's not right. Call the police, he said. I don't know how, Amanda said weakly. Try 911 or just ask Raffaele, Chris said. Okay, he's going to do that now, Amanda said, adding that he was just finishing talking to his sister, who was a lieutenant in the Carabinieri. At 12:51 p.m., Raffaele called the emergency hotline for the Carabinieri. And that's a more understandable, accessible version of the story, is that I didn't call the police, I didn't know how, I was in a foreign country. So what is the truth in terms of this question? Well, the obvious way to settle this question once and for all is via Amanda Knox's call logs, which we actually have. And what we see is under the list of outgoing calls Knox made, the police simply aren't there. Her mother is there several times, Philomena is there. But what's also interesting, and I think is the bottom line in terms of this analysis, is that her calls to Meredith are 3 and 4 seconds long, hardly long enough for anyone to answer, which reminds one of the Alec Murdaugh situation, holding his wife's phone after she was dead and calling her phone while holding his phone in the other hand. Now, although Knox didn't do this, I suspect that she called Meredith's phone simply to log the fact that she called. Otherwise, why did she not let it ring long enough for Meredith to answer? It's interesting to ask, did Knox know when she called Meredith twice that Meredith wasn't going to answer? Because Alec Murdaugh knew when he called Maggie that she wasn't going to answer. I think that call was also abruptly ended or cancelled. In fairness, Knox did speak to the police over the phone that day, over on her phone. But that happened because they called her, not the other way around. And that call was the longest conversation she'd had up until that point, the whole day, 4 minutes, 56 seconds, just under 5 minutes. I wouldn't be surprised if the cops got Knox's number either from Philomena or Sollecito, and they called her because they felt she was the person they most wanted to speak to. You could also make the excuse that since Knox couldn't speak Italian, she couldn't speak to the police, and that's why she didn't call them. And yet she had an Italian boyfriend, lived with 2 Italian housemates, and spoke to the police for almost 5 minutes when they did call. If they couldn't communicate, the call was likely to have been substantially shorter. Immediately after speaking to the cops, Knox called her mother and broke the record for her longest call so far that day. What I think is also revealing from the call records is that Knox didn't call Meredith at all. On Thursday, there were 2 calls to Meredith and a single call from Meredith in response on Wednesday, Halloween, which was the day Meredith went out with her friends and didn't invite Knox. And this is the part that's really interesting. Prior to that day, in fact, on the 4 days prior to that day, Knox and Kercher don't call each other at all. In fact, the last time Knox and Kercher spoke on the phone prior to Halloween was a 23-second call the previous Sunday, just after midnight. You might say, why would they need to call each other if they were roommates? But Knox stayed over at Sollecito during that period, and yet they still called each other multiple times daily. Interestingly, the one day they didn't call each other was the day Meredith's body was found. Wow. Wasn't Sollecito concerned about her on that day? You could also argue that if Sollecito called the police and she was standing next to him, doesn't that mean she made an emergency call after all? If she spoke sort of on the side, such as in the Idaho 4 emergency call, doesn't that qualify? Doesn't that mean technically she did call the police? You mean like Bethany and Dylan in their call? All right, if you want to compare them, let's compare them. Let's listen to Sollecito's call to the police.
Minieri? Pronto, buongiorno. Senta, qualcuno è praticamente entrato in casa sfondando la finestra e ha messo molto disordine, c'è una porta chiusa. La via è...
Io della Pergola.
Perugia Carabinieri? Della Pergola 7.
Via?
Della Pergola 7 a Perugia.
Via della Pergola 7, si fa abitazione, signor?
Allora guardi Amanda... chi abita dentro? Sono un gruppo di studenti a cui Amanda...
Now let's compare that call to the 911 call in the Idaho 4 case.
Of Idaho.
This happened in our house. We don't know what.
What is the address of the emergency?
1122.
Now bear in mind what we're dealing with is both of these are knife murders, and there's also a female survivor. And it does sound like you can sort of make out a woman's voice in the background, which might be Amanda saying or telling her boyfriend the address of the villa. I think another way of putting this, and a much simpler way of putting this, is, did John Ramsey call the police? Has John Ramsey ever said that he called the police? When, of course, he was probably standing next to Patsy when she called 911. But can John Ramsey say, I called the police?
911 emergency. Police. What's going on? 15th Street.
Now, if you pay attention to the call that Sollecito makes, he couldn't sound more lazy and sleepy than if he tried. There certainly doesn't seem to be any urgency in this call. And bear in mind, a murder has been committed, and for the sake of argument, there is a person missing in the story where there's apparently been a break-in.
Her first interview.
I felt very lost, very alone, and very vulnerable.
Vulnerable.
My friend had been murdered, and it could just have easily been me.
It is interesting, given that we know exactly what the circumstances were surrounding this emergency call, that it isn't dramatized this way in the Hulu series on Amanda Knox. Instead, we sort of see her spaced out, and that seems to basically be an explanation for everything. My friend had been murdered, and it could have been me. That doesn't ring true to me, though. If Alec Murdo or Buster Murdo had said that, what would you think? Or if Kate McCann said, I could have been abducted, or if Burke said, it could have been me, what would you say? Well, I'm not going to take it further than that, but what is also interesting is there's been breaking news in this case. The prosecutor has just come out with something of just a crazy allegation that another person went on the run. There's another suspect in the Amanda Knox case, and is basically asking whether they should perhaps reopen the case. Now, I can't see whether Amanda Knox has responded to this, but you'd imagine that someone who was involved in the case that this would be something that she would be interested in. The question is, would Amanda Knox want this case to be reopened? Would Amanda Knox want the case to be re-examined? Because I have to say, I would love to see this whole case re-examined. In the next episode, I want to look at the statement she makes, we were both sides of the same coin. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.